Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luhr, and I'm excited to have a gentleman calling in from Zurich, Switzerland today, who has truly lived and worked around the world for 3 decades, been on the forefront of sports marketing industry or the sports industry, multiple levels, tons of companies he worked with. It's going to be a packed 60 minutes here to cover this gentleman's career path and the amazing stories inside of it. So welcome to the podcast, Claude Ruibal.
Great to be here, Marcus. So nice to spend some time with you and talk about sport over the last 3 decades. I think I've got certainly a perspective on that and how it's evolved, but really excited to spend some time with you. You've obviously had an amazing group of people as part of your podcast, and feel honored to be able to join that group.
No, you fit right in there. Absolutely. And many people will obviously know who you are, or at least know of you in many of the roles you played over the years. But let me just give a quick sort of intro, framing it, what we'll be talking about. So we're going to go through the 3 decades you've been part of this beautiful environment of the world, and it's almost 4 decades to some degree, really.
Just don't tell everybody that.
And so, we're going to talk a bit about how it all started in the U.S. At the LA Olympics. Then we'll talk, the sort of one big block here of Saatchi and Saatchi, ISL, and Coca-Cola. I mean, that alone, I think we could do a whole podcast on. Then, you went on to Ask.com, Universal Sports, which is going to be some great stuff in there. And then, of course, really the last decade here, which was Google, and YouTube, which is going to be some great stuff. And then, of course, let's call it the Wonder Group Infront / HBS. And that's, I'm sure, where many people will know you from. Of course, your different roles there at the top end of the production world for FIFA World Cups and many other events. So, but before we get to all that part, let's go back again to how it all started. And you mentioned, you are from the U.S., even though your name could be a bit confusing for certain folks. So you have a bit of an interesting background there, I guess, being half Cuban and half. What was the other half again from? Hungary, sorry. That's right.
Dad's born in Cuba, Havana. My dad actually went to Catholic school with Fidel Castro in Havana, if you can believe that. Wow. They were in this same elementary school together. Weird.
I love that. Okay, well, that's a great way to start it already. And it gets more interesting because then you also did obviously some stuff in the U.S. with other U.S. presidents here. So now, but you did study at Georgetown University. You have your law degree there, and that's a big basketball university, of course, as well. So a little shout out there. But let's get in there. How once you graduated, my understanding is you got involved in the LA Olympics. Tell us a bit about that and how that sort of the early days there before we get to the Saatchi stories.
Sure. I mean, it was great being at Georgetown. It was the Patrick Ewing year, so obviously I had a pretty good team. Almost won the NCAAs while I was there. It was impressive, amazing coaching there. It was a great experience being in Washington, D.C., working on the Hill and the Senate for a while with some of the senators there, and it was just a terrific experience. But I always had this strong passion and interest in continuing to be involved in sports. I'd played some sports in high school. Not the main U.S. sports of, baseball, basketball, football, but I played tennis. I ran cross country and track. And then in college, I played a little bit of volleyball and tennis. And then coming out of law school, for me, the most exciting thing happening in the USA, I graduated law school in 1982. And if you look kind of ahead, in my mind, it was the 1984 Olympics. I mean, what more cool event could be happening in the domestic USA? It hadn't been at least in LA since 1932, so 52 years on. And led by Peter Ueberroth, who was really an inspirational kind of visionary leader. So a friend of mine worked in at the time, the Mayor Bradley. Tom Bradley was mayor, and he worked in the mayor's office. So I kind of networked through him to see if I could get an interview. It wasn't in the days of the internet where you could just find job postings and apply online. So you kind of had to work your way through to find an opportunity. So I put in my resume. I think I must graduate law school probably in May. And then come probably September, October, I got a call from the organizing committee, went in and interviewed and ultimately got a job kind of doing a little bit of everything. My first boss there was a woman named Anita de France. You're probably familiar with her name, but she's now been an IOC member since 1986. And it was a great experience. Ubroth was just incredible. His sort of number two guy, Harry Usher, they just had this vision around, not building all the facilities from scratch and spending billions of dollars to create sort of all the infrastructure you need for the games, but using existing facilities that were all around the greater LA area and all the way down to San Diego and up to Santa Barbara. And so I helped, probably, you think 2 years out before the Olympics, I mean, we were just, I think when I started, there were probably maybe 40 or 50 people on the organizing committee, maybe at the most 100. And you think today, 2 years before an Olympic Games, there's probably 2,000 people working in the local organizing committee or it's just, you just see how these things have exponentially gotten bigger and more complex as time has gone by. But I spent a lot of time negotiating a lot of the deals with the universities, UCLA, USC, UC Santa Barbara, where we would put basically all the athletes, and we created 3 athlete villages at those different facilities. The one in Santa Barbara was for the rowing, canoeing, and kayaking athletes, and it ended up turning out as we got closer and closer to the games, you had to become more and more specialized, and I was given the opportunity to lead the village up at UC Santa Barbara, partly because I'd graduated as an undergraduate from there. I'd been student body president there. I knew a lot of the university administrators, the chancellor.
Did they hire you as a lawyer, or in what particular role were you in?
They hired me not as a lawyer, but as a negotiator of agreements. I mean, I didn't come in as a lawyer per se in the legal department. I was really kind of I guess I would describe it is Olympic Family Services, I think is what our group was called. And we basically dealt with the National Olympic Committees and kind of dealt with all their needs as it relates to the athletes coming to the USA, housing them, feeding them, and then making sure that their experience as it relates to transportation, getting to the venues, training, and all that was real well taken care of. So we had to kind of organize all that.
I love it.
So during the games, I ran the village up in Santa Barbara. It was a great experience. We had a local leader, Pete Giordano, and his wife Gerd were our mayors, and they kind of were greeting all the athletes as they arrived from all around the world. And it went really, really well. As you know, the outcome of the games was, the LA Olympic Committee had I think about a $220 million surplus. Half of that money was given to the U.S. Olympic Committee. And then the other half was set up to create a foundation in LA to further help sports and youth development and sports in the greater LA area. So it was cool. A great foundational experience with a really broad group of young people making things happen. And it was kind of an early stage sort of modern office setup. We ultimately moved to a giant helicopter factory hangar that was left over in sort of Marina del Rey. And big open space planning, which today is very typical, but back then was very unusual and not sort of your normal setup.
I love it. Yeah, I had Chris Pepe on it recently. He's currently the chief commercial officer of LA 228. So we kind of started the story there, and I at that time shared my little 1984, right? Earlier, I think 86. I got the dates wrong here. Story of that, watching it from my bedroom. So as I said earlier, you were right in the middle of it, while I'm still was a young man watching it from my bedroom there at night. Now, before and I, as I said, we have so many stories, and I'd love to spend more there, but because it was such an amazing Olympic, it had a very big impact on me too. It was one of those moments where, I really grasped the world and the power of sports. Now, what was the big moment for you? Again, it was still early days for you as well as a young graduate there. What was sort of the highlight of it for you, if you look back at that event?
What I really found, and I think a good learning for me, was that we had this massive group, sort of cross-functional coordination from the people that ran the venues, the people that decorated the venues, the teams that organized the transportation, the teams that organized the medal ceremonies, the hospitality, everything that you had to kind of do and take care of as it relates to the athletes, as it relates to the competition. It was just a really well integrated team of people that worked really well together. There wasn't a lot of politics in the organization. I think it was just, everyone was all about getting it done and having and showcasing for everyone coming from all around the world to experience a great event in Los Angeles. Obviously, the worst day during that whole period was when Russia said they would be boycotting the event. Obviously, that was a pretty tough day for everyone, because that meant there were more countries besides Russia that wouldn't attend. And, I remember Peter, having a sort of open meeting with everyone sort of huddled on the main floor where we all worked, just sort of talking to everyone about it, keeping everyone positive. And then everyone did their best to try and attract as many at the time, Eastern countries to come and still, attend the games. Romania, as you may remember, attended. And most of the others probably continued and were part of the boycott. But that was a tough day. But ultimately, everyone got through it. The games still were incredibly successful. It would have been nice if everyone had attended, but it was what it was. Yes, and then the outcome with the profitability and showing that you could really make things work for an Olympic Games and not have a deficit that would really impact a city or a country for years afterwards, I think was really a great success for the Olympic movement. For Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was the president at the time, I think that was a real turning point for the Olympic movement. I think at the time when LA was bidding for the games, the only other city/country that was even bidding was Tehran, Iran. So, I mean, it wasn't like you had this huge bidding war, because I think at the time it was considered to be a risky thing to do, seeing what had happened up in Montreal and some of the other cities that had hosted the games.
Yeah. Now, so, let's wrap the LA Games there for a minute. You spent the next couple of, years, it's almost like 4 or 5 years before you then landed in Saatchi here, which we want to go to later. But what do you do in between? I understand there was something to do with some U.S. presidential elections and the launch of a small little football league. Talk us through that for a minute.
Well, I'd always say, I'd gone to law school in Washington, D.C., and I always sort of had this ambition and interest to work in the White House or work for a president, be involved in some role or capacity there. So I've been a Democrat all my life. I think you sort of inherit some of that from your parents, but certainly have a sense of the values and as a result, during the early stage of the presidential campaign, I got behind a candidate from Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, and basically just flew up to Boston again, just kind of knocked on the door and said, "Here, I'm here to volunteer." Everyone kind of said, "Great, go do this, go do that." And eventually during the primaries, because in presidential election, you have primaries state by state. So I worked in the primaries in California, up in Washington, and Pennsylvania, and a few other states, Delaware. And ultimately, Dukakis got the nomination and was, the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party against George Bush. Right. And actually coming out of the convention, I think, it was in August, Dukakis, had a pretty good bump and I think was leading in the polls and was doing quite well. During the general election, everyone was sort of seconded to do a specific job. And I was asked to kind of work with a woman named Dee Dee Myers, who ultimately became press secretary under President Bill Clinton. But Dee Dee and I worked together in California, kind of handling all the communications and press relations for the state of California for that election. But that was a really fun experience to kind of learn how to communicate a brand, so to speak, out to a broader audience. And was good learning. Ultimately, Bush won the election. So similar to the LA Olympics, as Peter Ueberroth said to all of us when we were working on the LA Olympic Games, and as it happened with Dukakis, you're given guaranteed termination at the end of the Olympic Games. So when Dukakis ultimately lost, we all sort of were said, "Thanks a lot for all the help and good luck in your life, and I hope you find a great job." So. Kind of coming out of that, actually, I actually was headhunted by someone. It didn't happen that way. I was a colleague of mine that I worked with on the LA Olympics had gone to work at the United States Football League with an individual named Harry Usher, who I mentioned earlier, who'd been sort of the number 2 guy on the LA Olympics. And the United States Football League was a rival to the NFL. It played in the summertime. It had quite a few teams, LA, Memphis, New Jersey, a number of places across the country. And they had a few seasons. And, it was looking like, they could kind of make a success of it. They had a really good contract, TV contract for distribution. And so after the first couple of seasons, I went there to kind of manage kind of player relations and kind of help the teams as it relates to the player contracts and relationships with the teams, and spent probably a year working on that. At the time, one of our owners was Donald Trump, and that was pretty interesting. We had a number of meetings with the owners a few times at his resorts down in New Jersey, and ultimately. the United States Football League decided they were going to sue the NFL and antitrust, feeling that they weren't being treated properly, and the NFL was sort of prohibiting them from being successful. It was a big lawsuit. There was a lot of money involved in terms of preparing and going through the lawsuit, and the United States Football League actually prevailed in the lawsuit, but then it was determined that the damages that would be assessed against the NFL was $1, and in antitrust lawsuits, damages are trebled, so that was $3. It was going to be given to the United States Football League, and that certainly wasn't it was a Pyrrhic victory, so to speak, for the United States Football League. And I think soon after that, I think the ownership and working with the commissioner decided that this wasn't really something that could prevail long term. And things disbanded.
Interesting, trying to sue the group who you're trying to get to Dubai. You're trying to sue them. That sounds like a bit of a Donald Trump move.
Well, I think that's very true. I mean, you play hardball, and I think they did play hardball. No one blinked. We ultimately won the lawsuit, but we kind of lost when it came to the damages. And certainly there was no need for the NFL and Pete Rozelle and his leadership at the time to try and acquire or merge with the USFL. So I think things slowly disbanded. So again, I took another job that I got terminated from, so to speak, because things ended. But that's okay. It wasn't because of my work. It was more just because the business was ending. But I kind of think of myself as a startup kind of guy. We spoke about this a little bit earlier, Marcus, and I think the LA Olympics is a startup business. The way we began the whole thing, I think Dukakis for president's a startup business, and frankly, the United States Football League was definitely a startup business. So there's some risks around that, but there can be a big upside, and that's what I find kind of engaging and exciting to do in life.
Yeah, no, it's and like I said, we're not even halfway through it, so and then we've already got these amazing stories here. So now somehow, obviously, you ended up coming in, for where you are in the US at that moment in time. Your next stop here is London, Paris, Madrid, and Barcelona, if, in whatever order that is, which ended up with Saatchi and Saatchi. How did you end up from, I guess, after the American Football League stopped, how did you get into the advertising industry world, I guess, in Europe?
Yeah, so I after Dukakis finished, I was already living in LA because I had been involved in running the California effort. So just stayed there, and probably a few months after that, a friend of mine knew a headhunter that was looking for someone who had some sports experience and sports marketing experience. I didn't have a lot of direct sports marketing experience at the time then, because I mostly worked sort of organizing the Olympics, but I guess I was able to convince the headhunter and ultimately my employers at Saatchi and Saatchi that I had enough experience and relationship with sports that they'd give me a shot. And what they were trying to do, Saatchi and Saatchi was a big agency headquartered out of London. They had acquired some other agencies, one called BSB, Backers Spielvogel Bates. So they had a number of sort of other agencies in some of the other key markets around the world. But they were finding, the account management teams and the creative teams were finding that a lot of their big brand companies that they work with, the Mars Corporation, Seiko, Visa, and a few others, were becoming, for the first time, sponsors of major big sporting events, be it the Olympic Games or the FIFA World Cup. And for a lot of these brands, and even for the agency side, the Saatchi and Saatchi side, they hadn't really had much experience around how do you leverage a brand relationship with a sport, and what should you do to activate that brand relationship with the sport. And so you have these really big agencies that are really good at creating 30 and 60-minute advertising commercials and creating promotional materials for in-store display and things like that. But there wasn't a large set of people within the organization at Saatchi and Saatchi in their key markets that had really done much work with, creatively, how do you link a brand to a sport? And if you're getting and becoming a sponsor of a sport, what do you do with these rights that you get? And at the time, I'll talk about this later, it hasn't really changed much since back then, but at the time, the rights a brand would be you get, in some cases, not at the Olympics, but on a lot of other sports, you get boards on the field of play for brand exposure, you get tickets and you get hospitality. And then for the Olympics, you can use the rings, along with other sports, you can use the logo of that organization on your product or in other points of sale to help, better define and associate yourself and have some, good rub off brand effect for your product with the consumer. But any kind of sophisticated sense on how best to do that, and having people that had some experience with account managing a rights holder, a federation, or the IOC, and leveraging those rights that you acquired in an optimal way. There just wasn't a real skill set there. So I actually moved to London, and they pretty quickly told me, well, you're going to actually have to open up. And again, this is another startup within a bigger company. You have to open up a team in Madrid, a team in Barcelona, a team in Paris, and a team in London. They're going to help the agency teams, the traditional agency teams and the creatives, work with all these sports organizations that have become sponsored by a lot of the brands that Saatchi and Saatchi were working with.
Right. And I think, again, there's a little 92 Olympic story, obviously, coming out of the 84. I'm assuming you had some good experience there. They put you on that as well. So that was sort of, I guess, the Olympics before you then moved on, right? With Saatchi.
Absolutely. So as part of setting up the team at our Paris office, our Paris Saatchi and Saatchi office, I brought in a person named Lucien Boyer, who since has had a great career in sports. And
he's a good friend. I know Lucien.
But I think he was at the LaRousse Formula One team at the time, and then he came to me through some networking, and we got along, and we thought we'd have him come in and lead the office in Paris. So he brought in a team. And, we started working with the local agency and doing a lot of sports related activities that was sort of France specific, around some sporting activities around football and some other things that were happening there. But ultimately we got an interesting, we pitched and we got an interesting win to really represent the European community, which was in the part of they were at the time, kind of unifying the EC and trying to kind of market that across the EC as being beneficial and a good thing to have. This is well before the times of Brexit. And the European community decided to probably invest, I think it was around $10 or $12 million as a sponsorship relationship with the Albertville Winter Games and the Barcelona Summer Games. Okay. So we were basically hired to come up with an activation around that. How could they best leverage that relationship with both those Olympic Games to further promote the benefits of the unification of the EC?
All right, interesting. Wow, cool. Now we're at we're 92 here. We're slowly working our way up here. And then now we kind of somewhat cross paths, probably without maybe knowing it. You ended up in ISL marketing, obviously, again.
You were up in Dallas, right? Is that where you
I was? Located? That's right. That was sort of some of your early story of how you started with the LA Games. Where you said you volunteered and you kind of got in there. That's how I got in there. I was studying in Dallas or in Fort Worth at that time, and I ended up working with the organizing committee first, and then eventually had a very small sort of job with ISL during the 1994 World Cup. But obviously you're there as senior VP, while I'm a little like an intern there, which is great. So my career started about 10 years later. And now again, in Saatchi and Saatchi, you're very much in the advertising space, as you said, brand leveraging, and figuring out how to use the investment the sponsor is making into these games, how to maximize it. Now, ISL is the other side of it, right? You are on you're on the side where you're selling to the sponsors and pitching to it. And from what I can see here, at least, you were pretty much across everything from TV to sponsorship and everything else. What was your main focus there? Was it just pure sales in all areas, or how was it broken down?
Yeah, I think if you look at my experience, I mean, we talked about some of the first things I did. I sort of didn't have much choice. The businesses ended, so I had to move on to find something new. But each time, even later in my career, I've always sort of found, like, after 3 or 4 or 5 years, I'm ready to go up the learning curve again and try something new. So I'd done a lot of work with Saatchi. I'd set up the offices in Madrid, and Barcelona, and in London. I think they were all doing really well. I hired a team of people for each of those offices, and they'd really built the capability to do effectively, leverage brands with sports. I'd never worked sort of on the federation side and agency side, and I'd always had sort of an interest in that. I'd met Mark McCormick once at the U.S. Open tennis tournament, just walked up to him and said, gee, I'd really like to work at your company. He said, well, here's my card, talk to this guy, and things didn't work out at the time. But it always seemed like, as part of my learning for my life, and kind of, I think life is always about constantly learning. it was a chance to come and work at an agency and leverage and help a sport, with broadcaster sales and with sponsorship sales, and to kind of help build that sport and the visibility of that sport on a global basis, and also help them organize their events on a city by city basis. So I was brought in and asked to kind of lead at the time called the International Amateur Athletics Federation, now called Athletics. And the leader of that was a guy named Primo Nebbiolo, who was located down in Rome. And his sort of chief of staff was a guy named Bob Fazzulo, who now is kind of the head of the International Surfing Association, or at least leads them as the general secretary, I believe. And so I spent most of my 4 or 5 years there really, helping the International Athletics Federation, IAAF, in their broadcaster sales and their sponsorship sales, and really kind of building visibility of that brand, and really increasing the sales to the broadcasters considerably, and helping kind of organize the events, market by market where they took place. But for me, it was just a great learning experience to see things from an agency side, a sports agency side of things. I hadn't really been doing that. I hadn't worked with brands in terms of selling to the brands. I'd helped the brands activate, but I hadn't had to sell into the brands, be it Nike, Adidas, Coca-Cola, and others. And in the process of doing a lot of those sales and working with the brands, I got to meet a guy named Sergio Zeman, who at the time was chief marketing officer of the Coca-Cola Company. And kind of thinking back to my Saatchi days and thinking back to, it'd be really interesting to actually work for a brand and help them with their sports relationships and help them activate, but inside the brand itself as opposed to an agency. So as things evolved at ISL, ultimately I got sort of an opportunity to interview for the head of football, meaning soccer worldwide for Coca-Cola, which probably at the time was a $200 to $300 million global investment around football, between the rights fees they paid, and the local relationships with the national leagues, national federations, and then all the activation around the sport. It was really powerful for Coca-Cola, and so it was.
I'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to jump in for a second with one funny little story, because when I was looking at ISL, I only later sort of realized, you were more in the IWF side of it. Actually, I was a true intern at the 1993 Stuttgart IWF event.
So this was there then too.
Somehow we
spent a lot of time in Stuttgart, that's for sure.
So I was there literally just for a week or two, probably, for the actual event. And I'm just blanking out, unfortunately, on the gentleman's name. He was with ISL at that time, who brought me in there. And again, thanking him enough for that. I had the absolute blast. I was somewhat in the hospitality suite. That's where I met Papa. Papa Dyke and we ended up working there together.
Papa Dyke was around that time. Actually, he was on my staff. He was one of the people working on the athletics program. His father was, one of the council members at the time, and was from Senegal, and was involved, obviously, in the federation.
Yeah, so Papa has been on the podcast as well, and we've dug deep into some of those stories already. But yeah, so this is funny how what a small world. Obviously, as I said, we didn't quite really cross paths there. But so coming back, so we were in Switzerland, having fun there, working in the world athletics space. And now you off to Atlanta, Georgia, to Coca-Cola, which, arguably is the largest global sponsor in the world of sports on so many levels. It probably still is till today, unless I can think of someone else who maybe is out muscled in by now. But it's just a huge entity, spending, as you said, hundreds of millions of dollars in the world of sports, and you're coming in there to manage their global football. So again, you're coming in from being on the ad agency side, then you're pitching and selling. And now you're the client, which is, I'm sure, a very different sense and feel to it, right? All of a sudden everyone runs after you because you got the money and you have the power. I mean, what's the big difference for you? I mean, how did you see this? Was it that dramatic as what I describe it, or how would you describe it actually doing it?
Well, it was pretty exciting. When I came in, it was actually coincident with Coca-Cola renewing their relationship with FIFA. They've been a FIFA sponsor, I think, from the 30s. Yep. Same with the IOC sponsorship. They're really kind of one of the early adopters of sports sponsorship, so to speak. And obviously the the rights for sponsorship had evolved. And Horst Dosser, what he'd set up with the agency and ISL in the mid '80s, and creating exclusivities for categories so that Pepsi couldn't also be a sponsor at the same time Coca-Cola was a sponsor, and then creating the brand exposure with the boards around the field of play, tickets and hospitality. I mean, those are sort of the basic programs. But as I came into Coca-Cola and was working with Chuck Fruit, who kind of headed up sort of all the TV and relationships with sports, and also Scott McCune, who was my boss at the time. There was a sense that how can we get more out of these sponsorship relationships, in particular with FIFA, because that was the one we were renewing, and how can we create more touch points with consumers beyond just point of sale, and using the brand of the event or the logo of the event. And so as we were negotiating with Coke, we came up sort of with, well, if we could get flag bearers, player escorts, and ball boys, if we could get the opportunity to have some of those kids on the field of play during the game, that would be a really interesting promotional offer that we could have globally to say, if you buy X amount of Coca-Cola, you can then apply to have your son or daughter potentially be one of those flag bearers, escorts, or ball boys, and be out there during the game itself. So we negotiated kind of those extra rights, beyond the basic, board exposure, hospitality, and tickets, and it became a really powerful tool for the global team at Coca-Cola to use at their point of sale and in their promotion. I mean, the Olympics is obviously a very important prestige brand for Coca-Cola to be associated with, but I will say that the World Cup, in my view, is probably the most activated sport on a global basis. If you're looking at 190, 200 countries around the world where Coca-Cola distributes, I'd probably say you're looking at close to 150 of those countries are actively investing and leveraging that relationship, and probably maybe 100 of them were using the opportunity to be one of those kids on the field to play in their promotional efforts to get the moms and dads to get excited about having that for their kid. And ultimately it was a pretty complex thing to run, where you're thinking about bringing a child from the USA or wherever, and having them show up in a country and taking care of the child and making sure that everything goes well and they get back home safely. That was a big undertaking for the system, but the payoff around being able to use it and have those assets was really important and valuable. So I learned a lot about how to activate a brand around a sport, how to create promotional components to that, and to work with the agencies around the sort of bigger activation in terms of the advertising and marketing. It was a great experience to be inside and understand kind of the value that a brand can have around the sports relationships, where you wouldn't necessarily be told that if you're working externally at an agency or either a marketing agency or a sports agency.
I can see that. I'm sure. Actually, you know what? When I graduated from university, my vision always was to be sort of marketing director at Coca-Cola. That was my big dream. I never thought of actually working in an agency or running an agency myself, but it was always like Coca-Cola sounded like a fun place. Now, here's a fun story, a question for you. When I was in the US and how I got into football was I was German, so football is my blood. I went up to a few people saying, "Look, I'm from Germany, and I probably know more about football than half your people in the office here. Or more. That's why you should hire me." Now, you're an American. You've been in the Olympics. You did track and field, which is big Olympic sport as well. How on earth did Coca-Cola hire you in football?
I think a lot of things in life happen because of relationships. So I got to know Sergio Zeman. I was activating and managing the IAAF, but I really wanted to work on the brand side, and I negotiated a deal with Zeman's involvement and Chuck Fruit's involvement to renew a relationship with the IAAF, World Athletics. As part of that process, we got to know each other, and so I kind of talked to him and said, "Hey, I'm interested in making a move." To be honest with you, we'd spent 5 years in Switzerland, 92 to 97. I'd gotten married during that time, or just a little bit before I got to ISL. I got married in 91. And then my daughter was born in 96. So it was kind of interesting for us to maybe go back to the States. It wasn't that we didn't like Europe. We loved being here, but it was sort of fun because both of our parents, my wife's parents were in St. Louis and my parents were down in the LA area. To kind of, now that we had a kid, it was probably nice to kind of be closer to our respective parents and spend some time so that we were a little bit closer with them. So it seemed like a good opportunity to kind of come back to the States, and at the same time I could go work, at sort of the biggest sports brand in the world as it relates to sponsoring events, Coca-Cola, and really see a sophisticated activation of those sports and learn a lot from the inside, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now let's get into the next block here. In the 2000s, of course, internet is booming. We have .com boom and bust to some degree, and you had a little fair share of that as well, because you got into Ask Jeeves, which again, anyone who's old enough would remember that, the company there. So how did you jump into, Coca-Cola or doing global football, which, again, they sort of, you could see with your, all the roles you'd played previously made a lot of sense. All of a sudden you're in a, internet company at that time. They wouldn't call it digital yet, and you're running there. You are vice president of international business. So how did that jump occur?
So I'm in Atlanta working at Coca-Cola and, to a certain extent selling, sugared water, carbonated sugared water. And while I'm there, I actually got, a fairly good internet connection at our house. And I started streaming sports events because there was this company called Quokka Sports. I don't know if you remember Quokka Sports, but it might predate you. Where they were streaming the America's Cup, they were streaming a bunch of climbing events, and I can't even remember all the other things they streamed, but they were like ahead of their time. So unless you had a fairly good internet connection in your home, there's no chance you would even be able to leverage and use that. They had all sorts of data and graphics integrated with their streaming, so it made it really interesting. I'm way ahead of their time, way ahead of their time. So this is probably 98, 99, 2000. And I'm talking to my friends, if you remember in the late 90s, you have Amazon.com starting, Pets.com. It was just the internet boom. I mean, everything was just taking off.
Correct.
And I'm at Coke, and things are fine and stable, and it's a great, big, terrific company. But I'm talking to my friends and my colleagues that are the same age as me. So many of them are off to California, off to the Silicon Valley,
.com place,
the internet. I mean, it's just like, they're saying, Claude, what are you doing sitting there, selling sugar water? I was working on creating a website for some of our sports relationships at Coke and doing some of that work, but not really working in technology and not really learning, so to speak, the internet. Yeah. And I kind of felt like, well, that probably back to kind of this concept is, you're always learning in life. And I kind of like the concept of changing what you do periodically to kind of further round out your skill set. It seemed, in the late 90s, so like 1999 at the time I was considering the move, it seemed like, well, this is probably a good thing to go try and do. And I was actually skiing in Colorado, going down the slope, and mobile phones existed then. My phone's ringing, and I just pick it up, and there's this guy. Hi, I'm George, and I'm interested in maybe I sent my resume out to a bunch of places. I got your resume. It looks like he might be someone who could come help us with business development at Ask Jeeves. I didn't even know what Ask Jeeves was at the time. So I said, well, sure, it sounds really interesting. And I immediately kind of went to go find out what Ask Jeeves was, which ended up being one of the early search engines, like
correct.
And so, we talked it over, my wife and I. It sounded like it was a great place to be. It was going to be in Los Angeles. The headquarters for Ask Jeeves was up in the Bay Area, but in Oakland actually. But the international team and the international division was actually in Santa Monica. And again, my parents lived in the LA area or near LA in a town called Riverside, where I grew up. And it just seemed like a good opportunity to kind of, again, learn something new. It seemed really topical. This was like, this was the thing to do. Everyone was jumping into the internet. So
what was exactly your role in there? I see a little bit about you. You helped raise some of the funding. You launched, I guess, some of the international platforms, UK, Japan. So it was really obviously a very different thing than you were doing before. Again, you just sort of jump into the deep end, I guess, with.
Yeah, so the concept was, we wanted to build Ask Jeeves sort of subsidiaries that are country specific. So an Ask Jeeves for Latin America, so a Spanish speaking Ask Jeeves, and then an Ask Jeeves in the UK, which obviously took off really quickly because it was just relevant. Ask Jeeves is like such a UK term.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Ask Jeeves Australia. And then we had organizations that were investing capital, either private equity firms or others that were investing capital to kind of, launch all these Ask Jeeves, localized Ask Jeeves websites to kind of provide search solutions on a regional or country and language specific basis. And then we also had an Ask Jeeves search solution, which was basically something you could put. At the time, websites were getting more and more sophisticated. If you remember in the early days of websites, you'd go to a website and you just have like an index and you'd click on the index and you'd kind of find things that way. But very few websites had a search box and you'd put in a word or a term and find what you needed on the website by just putting in the search query. That just didn't exist much back then, but all these sites were getting pretty big and sophisticated and complicated, and just finding things through an index wasn't really that achievable, and putting a search box on your website seemed to make a lot more sense. So I was also involved in helping sell that search solution to bigger websites that existed in the world. And the very first sale we did for that software solution actually was to the IOC. I got a Rolex watch as the first salesman to sell the search solution, and the IOC bought the solution and put it on the IOC website, and that was the beginning of the Ask Jeeves search solution sales on a global basis to a lot of other websites worldwide. But it was a pretty exciting time, but it also was, my timing was probably really bad in the same sense, because probably soon after I got there, if you recall, in the early 2000s, the internet crashed.
Absolutely.
And the companies, pets.com failed, and there was one failure after another. And when I got to Ask Jeeves, our stock, I think, was probably at $30 or $40 a share. And probably in the course of 3 or 4 months that I was there, the stock had gone down to about $2 or $3 a share. And people were saying, they're going to get delisted and it's not going to even be on the stock exchange any longer. And there was this great sense like, oh God, this thing's going to collapse. And I unfortunately got tasked with letting a lot of people go, and it really wasn't a whole lot of fun, but I guess you learn from everything in life. And, I sort of got pretty good at letting people go in a nice way. And sometimes I just have meetings with people and be asking them questions about things and finding out how the business was going. And we'd finish the meeting and they'd leave and they'd come back 10 minutes later and they'd say, I was so worried. I thought you were going to fire me today. I said, no, I'm not going to do this. I just became the guy that if Claude wants to meet, you might be let go. It's
That's all right. Yeah.
But ultimately things prevailed with Ask Jeeves. We got a really good distribution deal with Google, actually, where Google had just too much inventory, advertising inventory. So they actually were offloading some of their inventory onto the Ask Jeeves search results. So that really helped kind of get the company stable again. The stock sort of came back up, and then Barry Diller with his corporation ended up acquiring the company. I can't remember whether it was 2003, 2004. And then the sort of shares that I had that had, slowly dwindled down to not be worth too much ultimately were worth something. And after the acquisition, there were a lot of changes at the company, and I think I was probably asked to leave or let go because they weren't kind of pursuing the same kind of strategy we've been pursuing before. So I found myself in a transitional moment and was kind of looking to see what I was going to do next.
Yeah, and that's where we are now. So we're now in 2003 here. You've been out there doing things for almost 20 years already at that point in time. And from the looks at it, at least, you sort of now, you co-founding the new company here. Again, it's a big partnership. There's private equity money involved. Maybe, I don't know whether that private equity money is someone you work with at Ask Jeeves as well, or how did that all come about? How did Universal Sports Cable and Digital Network come about?
So one of my colleagues that I'd worked with at ISL, a guy named Tom Hipkins, who had been general counsel at ISL, he had found his way to San Diego. I don't think he was working at the time. So he and I kind of got reacquainted or got together, and, I was sort of thinking about things that could be done in the USA and, thinking about technology, thinking about streaming, what I'd seen on Quokka Sports. And I said to him, I'd spent 5 years in Europe, and I got used to being able to watch, the ski season, the FIS ski season and all the races that you can see across the season of skiing. And I got used to seeing, a season of all these Olympic sports that were fairly typical in Europe. They were all produced and they were all actively watched in Europe. The seasons were all produced across gymnastics and track and field and swimming. But most Americans thought Michael Phelps swam every 4 years at the Olympic Games, and then he just went, just hung out and didn't do much in between. But obviously all these athletes have to stay tuned up and compete and be at the highest level on an ongoing basis. And he was competing in all sorts of events that FINA were putting on their world championships and their World Cup seasons. Right. And so I kind of looked at the landscape. While NBC was obviously the Olympic sponsor and was deeply embedded in the Olympic Games themselves, there really wasn't any kind of cable broadcaster or streaming opportunity to see these seasons of Olympic sports. No one was, and they were already being produced in Europe and being distributed by a lot of the broadcasters across Europe. So it wasn't like you had to go out and pay to produce these events. The stream, live feed existed.
The product was there.
So conceptually, Tom and I just said, well, let's put a business plan together that says we're going to create, a specialty channel focused on all the Olympic sports, because, there's obviously exciting American athletes that would interest, viewers in the USA. There are exciting international athletes that would interest viewers too. This is all produced. So other than just acquiring the rights, it shouldn't be too complicated, and getting a feed into the USA, which shouldn't be too complicated either. So we kind of said, well, let's go do it. And, he and I both put probably a couple, maybe 100,000 each into a bank account and just started spending our money, trying to basically, the goal initially, probably in 2004, 2005, was just acquiring rights. Could we even go to these federations and get them to even sell to us? I mean, here we are, like two guys, who are you two? I mean, should we trust to sell, our rights to you for the USA marketplace? But, there weren't a lot of broadcasters or others that were that interested for a lot of these sports to even acquire these rights. Okay. And for those that did acquire the rights, they probably just wanted them for certain events and wouldn't really show that many hours of the event itself anyway. So even if you did get to see it, it probably was just a highlight, delayed, never live. We started knocking on the doors of the federations and talking to them about our concept. We both had some experience working in the international sports space already, having been at ISL and Coca-Cola for me. So we had some credibility. So it wasn't like we didn't have credibility when we walked in the door. Yeah. And ultimately, I remember the day, it was probably sometime in 2005, mid-2005, we were in Switzerland with the International Gymnastics Federation, negotiating a rights deal with them for probably 3, 4, 5 years, and it was probably like quite a bit of money at the time, $400,000 or $500,000, $600,000. I mean, we didn't even have anything close to that in the bank, but we certainly had the ability to sell this into the federation, and they signed a deal with us. And I remember we signed the contract, and Tom and I are on the train back to Lausanne from meeting with the federation, and we both kind of looked at each other, and we kind of said, well, we're all in now. It's like, no turning back.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
A whole lot of money. And, we didn't have that kind of capital to even make the thing happen, but we just felt, we had to, as we'd been talking concurrently to investors about the business, they all said, yeah, sounds like a really interesting concept, makes sense, could probably work, but what rights do you have? And we'd say, well, we're negotiating those rights. Well, they'd all say, well, come back to us when you have rights with 10 sports, or come back to us when you have rights with 15 sports, whatever it might be. But there was always this sense of like, show us that you actually have the content, then we'll be more comfortable investing with you guys. It wasn't about creating a product, meaning some technology product. Was about just creating the content so that you could then distribute that in the domestic USA.
You have to do a little bit of bluffing here and there. I get that. That's what you do.
Exactly. But I mean, look, it wasn't like we didn't believe we couldn't do it. We knew we could do it, but we just had to go get these rights and put up a fair amount of commitments. We didn't have the capital yet, but we made the commitments to basically buy those rights at a reasonable number, certainly a bigger number than any of these federations have been offered before or offered at all from distributors in the USA marketplace. And for all of them, it was a win-win, because one, they were getting some capital, and two, they were getting exposure that they'd never had in the domestic USA before, both for their brand sponsors of the federation and for their fans. So I think everybody was pretty
So
excited.
how did you get from the idea, which is, I fully get it, and anyone who has ever done a startup like this in terms of trying to buy rights, and whether you're building a channel or whether you're building a distribution on the back of it, how do you get from that actually then having a channel and obviously bringing in NBC and others to the vision? What's the step there? The short version of that.
Well, you go through a lot of stress.
That's for sure.
As one person we were meeting with at the time, and I think he sort of said it well. He says, you'll have the worst day of your life and the best day of your life all in the same day. It's just, there's always some new thing that comes up. And I'm working with a lot of startup companies now in my new venture, Ubiquity Sports, and a lot of the founders. And I see what they're going through. They're trying to run their business startup. They're trying to hire all the right people so they can run their business. And at the same time, they're trying to secure capital so they can run their business and build a product, by the way, that's going to be successful to make their business work. And you're juggling all these balls at the same time, and you don't always have good results concurrently. You rarely do. There's always something that went right that day, but something else didn't go right that day. So there's But it's kind of an exciting stress, to be honest with you. It's kind of like the high when you go running and you feel good after you really went through some pain through a hard run or a hard bike ride. They get that endorphin rush, so to speak. So I kind of feel that way with startups. It's just I feel that that's kind of exciting parts about life. How can you create something new and different and products that's going to really make people excited and happy on a global basis or on a domestic basis in the case of Universal Sports.
So do they come in, and I see you raised $100 million. I mean, these are all fairly significant numbers, even with all the great background both of you guys had. So how do you get people to come in and spend that money with you and really believe in your story here?
Well, at first you get angel investors. So we talked to friends and family and others, sort of like Jeff Bezos when he was out starting his venture, went to his parents and got some money there. And, so we got some initial along with, the one thing that I remember going to the private equity guys, they were all sort of like going, well, are you guys really committed to this? You're going to stick with this? And I would always say, well, I actually sold my house and used the money from my house sale and invested in my company. And they all said, great, you've got stake in the game. I know you're going to make sure this works. So that was always a good thing to let them know.
Right.
But, so we got some angels to come in and, every time you get some money and you think, oh, that's going to last me forever. And then, a month goes by and like, we got to get more money. It just goes so fast sometimes. Yep. But ultimately, we were talking to some early stage investors, and there was a company called Providence Equity Ventures up in the Boston area. They'd done a lot more work sort of in the health industry, but a guy named Mike Hirschland took sort of interest in us. We met with a lot of their partners, talked to them about the concept, and ultimately I think they put in probably quite a few million just to start. And, that was for us like a fortune, where before we were getting sort of $50,000, $100,000 investments from different angel investments. This was like, we thought we'd have more money for years. Of course, didn't last very long at the time, but it really helped us kind of turn the corner and build some legitimacy in the business. And then we were spending a lot of time trying to build strategic relationships with organizations, in particular NBC and NBC Sports. Dick Ebersol was running at the time, and Gary Zenkel was running the whole Olympic part of the business. So we'd spent some time meeting with them and talking to them about the concept. We met with ESPN and talked to them about what we were trying to do. We talked to Eurosport because maybe they'd want to invest to kind of an extension of what Eurosport was already doing in Europe. So we tried to see, what kind of strategic partners could we bring in besides capital. NBC kind of was interested, but not that interested. I think they felt this was a space they wanted to be in, but probably didn't want to necessarily invest in it per se. But then we got to a point probably in 2007, we'd launched kind of a streaming product. We were already distributing some of the content. We'd had the track and field world championships on the platform that we distributed both on TV and streaming. And
what was it called at the beginning? What was the original name?
Original name was called World Championship Sports Network, WCSN. Okay. So up until probably 2008, that was the name. And then we got a group of people called Intermedia Partners, a guy named Leo Hendry, who'd done a lot of work in the cable industry, and another individual named Peter Kern. We met with Peter and his team and talked to them about the concept. They had just started a fund and invested in a whole bunch of companies, including Vice, if you're familiar with Vice. Was one of their early investments. And so they took a liking to us and decided to invest. At that point in time, that was kind of the inflection point for Tom and I as the founders, where we had to raise so much capital we couldn't maintain a majority control of the company, which unfortunate, but it's just, when you're trying to create a cable venture beyond just a streaming venture, they're just fairly capital intensive in terms of the infrastructure and things you have to do to be able to distribute on a global basis through the cable industry. Yeah. So we got a really significant investment from Intermedia Partners. It was much appreciated. And I think at the same time, when that happened, I think NBC realized we weren't necessarily going to go away. As we were leading up to that investment in 2008, other individuals and organizations were looking at what we were doing in terms of creating this Olympic sports destination in the USA and kind of liking our idea. So we had some people kind of replicating what we were trying to do, which wasn't necessarily helpful at the time. Peter Roth decided to launch sort of an Olympic channel, was using an effort, I think, working with Comcast or Discovery to try and create an Olympic channel that the U.S. Olympic Committee would be involved with. I think Peter was leading USOC at the time. Right. And at the same time, Casey Wasserman, who now heads up the whole effort for LA 28, he decided to invest in some of the content rights that we have because he thought maybe he should do the same thing. So as a result of those things, the rights marketplace, the agents were super happy, the federations were super happy, because suddenly you have sort of three organizations trying to acquire rights for Olympic sports at the same time, where we had been the only bidder until then. Right. So that pushed some of the price points really high, which made it pretty difficult for us to compete. And in some cases, we just passed because we felt the prices were just outrageously too high, and you weren't really going to be able to make a business around that. And ultimately, what saved us was I think the investment from Intermedia and NBC ultimately seeing us as sort of the horse they wanted to tie themselves to. So we created a partnership with the help from the team at Intermedia with NBC Sports, NBC Olympics, and they then gave us a lot of distribution across some of the bandwidth they had with the main broadcast networks in a lot of the key markets domestically in the USA, which really then got our channel distributed to a lot of homes across the USA and really helped us significantly to kind of build up the business.
Was the platform only available in the US, or you had certain global rights as well, or certain global ambitions?
I think we had. On some of the deals we did, they just, at the time, 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, there wasn't much, a lot of these federations didn't see a lot of value in their streaming rights. It wasn't something that was important or necessary to keep. So I think for a lot of the cases, we got global rights. But the main push, and at the time, we felt the biggest return on the investment, the biggest opportunity would be to build a really powerful cable channel that would distribute, to 80 million, 70 million, 50, 60 million homes in the USA through cable TV, and maybe have some streaming offerings domestically and internationally. But the real value driver was to have a really powerful cable offering in the domestic USA.
So just to wrap that part up here, and what we're talking about right now, that's almost 7 or 8 years, obviously, a journey here. This isn't something which has happened over a few years. So it's clearly a long, nice journey there for your as an entrepreneur in a sense. What was the exit then? You sold out. It was taken over by someone, or what happened there? Just the final part to the story here.
Well, actually, as Tom and I had lost control of the business, I brought in another person named Carlos Silva, who came in. He'd been working on digital stuff out of Washington, D.C. He sort of became the chief operating officer. I was CEO. And then I think, our investors felt they needed a change at the top. So actually, they showed up one day at our offices in LA, Santa Monica, and said, well, we're going to change things at the top. Even though you're the founders, you can still kind of be around, but we want someone else to run the business. I think maybe that was driven in part by NBC too, but probably a different view on strategy. So So Carlos and I were shown the door, so to speak, which is fine. I mean, I felt we built a good business and an interesting opportunity for consumers in the domestic USA. It was always great to be in an elevator wearing a Universal Sports branded jacket and have someone come up to you and said, "Oh, I love your channel. I got to see the whole ski season. You made me so happy." And those are the kind of things that really make you feel good when you're touching consumers in a way that they haven't been touched before. So some new management was brought in to run the channel. I stayed on as chairman, which was fine. I wasn't running the day-to-day. I was non-exec. I was providing some oversight and some thoughts on kind of how things can be done and the relationship with the rights holders. But for me, it wasn't kind of a full-time thing and wasn't something I wanted to continue doing. And then, again, Headhunter called and was interested, and they were trying to fill a role to have someone, quote, run sports at Google and YouTube. And, Google and YouTube hadn't really done a whole lot in sports. Certainly Google on the product side weren't doing a whole lot in sports. And then YouTube had a lot of sports content on their platform. Almost 100% of it was uploaded by third parties, individuals who were just uploading stuff that they'd, taken off the TV and put up on the platform.
Not supposed to either. Yes.
Right. It was basically copyright infringement. Exactly. Exactly. So I went through a process, met a whole bunch of people at Google. The Google interview process is pretty lengthy, and went through a few days of interviews and a lot of interesting questions, and talked a lot about kind of my vision around streaming and how YouTube could evolve. And I think sort of hit it off with the team there, and was offered a position to start on my birthday, the 10th of January, 2011. So that was an interesting start date. So happy birthday. And off I went to go.
How did it feel? I mean, again, the last 7 or 8 years, you were your own boss to some degree. I mean, obviously you had large investors in, so you're not really always your own boss anymore when that happens. But now you're back into a very large company. I mean, never mind how big Google is now, but even at that time, Google was already, a fairly substantial company, growing like crazy, and of course dominating its space, or in the process of dominating it. I mean, there must have been an interesting, again, is there a culture shock there to get into sort of this sort of Silicon Valley company now, or how did it feel?
Well, having been at Ask Jeeves and always sort of admiring Google as a better search engine and a better company, so to speak, it was always sort of like, well, that'd be a cool place to work. But at the time, with my sports experience and maybe some of my BD experience at Ask Jeeves, I probably could have applied to try and work there, but it just didn't kind of pass my mind at the time. But then, it evolved at Google with their acquisition of YouTube in 2006. I think they realized they probably needed to be more professional on the sports side of things, along with a lot of the other content verticals they had, news, entertainment, things like that. So they brought in sort of specialists in the field. It was just sort of good timing and a good place for me. Obviously, a really great company. There were probably about 30,000 employees at the time I started there. There's probably double or triple that by now, but just a massive growth engine as an organization. But between what Larry Page and Sergey created and Eric Schmidt as the chairman, it was just an amazing, exciting place to go work at. That was just a nice, fun transition. And for me, it didn't feel like a big, complex organization, though it was. It just was, for me, I was doing another startup within YouTube to try and create, a sports team to try and find a way to get rights holders, soccer and all the other Olympic sports, and then the main sports in the USA, baseball, basketball, football, onto the platform, because most of them, wanted to have nothing to do with the platform. In fact, they wanted to sue the platform and stop them and take down all this content that was sitting on the platform because they felt it infringed their copyright. So that
probably your legal background helped a bit there. So how did you convince them? How did you convince the FIFAs, the IOCs, UEFA, NFLs, and EPL, etc.? How do you convince these guys that, hey, you can trust us, we can monitor, we can match it up, we can even pay you some money, we put ad dollars around it? How did that all come about? Was that, did you do some of that during your time there?
100%. I think I probably, with my team, the first thing it was sort of hire a global team, across YouTube and Google. So we hired people that were headquartered in the UK. Then we had country-specific people that were seconded to us part-time to do sports, across Europe and India and Asia, and then in the USA and Latin America. And then we said, how can we create legitimacy on the YouTube platform to get sports rights holders to feel like this is a safe haven for their content, and it's a place they should put their content as opposed to a place they should stop having content put on. Yep. So we looked at the world of sport, and we all said to each other, well, what's the world's biggest sport? Well, that's soccer, football. So we need to win with football first. And if we can win with football first, we think everything else will follow, because we'll show legitimacy for the platform and create an opportunity for these rights holders to feel that this is a safe place for their content. So started meeting with a lot of the agencies and the rights holders themselves to get them to put football content on the platform. Went to go meet with Richard Scudamore, who was heading up the English Premier League at the time. Met with Andrea Rozzini, who is now running 11 Sports. And he was sort of representing the Italian football league at the time, Serie A. And we just sat down and started talking to them. And, frankly, these early meetings I would have, they'd sit down with me and I'd get the big hand in my face and say, we're super unhappy with your platform. You guys are pirates. You're copyright infringers. We want nothing to do with this. The only reason I'm having this meeting is to tell you about how unhappy I am about YouTube, and you've got to do something about this. Right. And then, I'd kind of leave the meeting going, it didn't go so well. And then, the next day, they would be in the press that, I met with such and such sports lead, and, they were using my meeting with them, not to criticize me, so to speak, in the press, but to get all the broadcasters scared that suddenly Google's now going to buy sports rights, which means we can start doing at that point in time. Right. You've seen some of that happening now with Amazon and a little bit with Google and YouTube, but it takes a long time to get those larger organizations comfortable with those kind of investments. But in any case, ultimately, the developers at Google, the developers at YouTube, had created a product called Content ID. And Content ID allowed a rights holder to either track, block, or monetize any uploaded content that existed on our platform. Basically, those rights holders had to give us reference material. So if they had, the English Premier League had a live event, we'd get a copy of that live event in real time plugged into our servers. The server would index all of that and understand what that event looks like. So then if you uploaded that game onto your YouTube channel right after the event, you might start getting a lot of views on that clip or highlight that you put up there, or even the whole game. But now the rights holder could identify all of that in the content management system and then decide whether they wanted to block it, track it, or monetize it. So that product really kind of broke the dam, so to speak, to allow rights holders to realize they were in full control but what was happening on the YouTube platform, and it's ultimately that control allowed them to feel comfortable to now put the content onto the platform. And for some of the big rights holders, sure, we had to give some maybe upfront guarantees against the revenue they would make against the content on the platform, but we weren't really in the position or interested in paying rights fees, so to speak. It was more a guarantee against future revenues and the advertising revenues they would get against.
Like a rev share model, in a sense, right?
Exactly right. Exactly.
Oh, okay, interesting. I mean, I do recall those days. Obviously, we were representing certain rights holders there as well, and we always similar. In those early days, there was a lot of battles with YouTube of how you track it and how you pull things down, and people had to make phone calls and chase folks. Obviously now that's mostly automated and it runs fairly smooth. So that the early days were fun. Now you did some interesting work with the IOC then, right? Because 2012 and the 2014 Olympics, you was some more of an official partner, if I recall this correctly, right?
Yeah, what we were starting to see on the YouTube platform that we were doing Indian Premier League cricket live on the platform, and you were seeing the channels that were streaming those live events were getting a huge bump in subscribers. And at YouTube, it's about how many subscribers you have. If you have subscribers, they get notified about when you have new content on the platform, and you get a lot more viewing of your content. So subscribers were an important metric for YouTube channels, and live content on a channel was really driving up the subscriber base. And the IOC, Timo Lume and the team at the IOC, I think weren't having a lot of success or weren't happy with the distribution they were getting in some key markets across Africa and Asia for those two Olympic Games, and basically came to us and said, well, would you be interested in streaming those events on YouTube into those markets, geo-blocked to those markets, but at least having those markets an opportunity to view this through a streaming platform in those markets. And we were super excited about that. And again, it helped kind of reinforce the value of live from my view and my team's view. So we negotiated for those rights, and I think coming out of those two events, the IOC saw a huge bump in their subscriber base. It really also helped me internally to fight for live content on the platform. If you remember, YouTube was mostly about highlights, and there wasn't necessarily a strong understanding or motivation to have live sports rights on the YouTube platform. It wasn't necessarily something that was in the mindset of a lot of the founders of Google or really kind of in their core interest area. But I felt it was a key driver for the platform and a key driver for the channel. So, we tried to look at where could we get other live content on the platform. And, kind of one of the biggest events we did, it was really the work of the person who runs YouTube and Google Sports now, a guy named Tim Katz. He kind of keyed up on this whole Red Bull Stratos jump, if you remember that taking place in October of 2012, where Felix Baumgartner jumped from space, and back down to Earth. It was a really big deal live event. So we became the streaming and distribution partner for Red Bull of this event, and it was just an amazing experience because, and I'm sure you've been to Sportel a few times, but it took place during Sportel, 14th of October. And I remember sitting on my hotel room bed at the Fairmont Hotel, looking out at the ocean and on a Google Hangout with, probably 30 people, the engineers, Tim, and all sorts of other people, basically monitoring, the Red Bull Stratos jump as Felix went higher and higher into space. And we sort of planned to have maybe 2 to 3 million live concurrents watching this thing at the same time, and we figured we could manage that load. And he's like halfway up to as high as he has to go, and we're already at 3 million live concurrents. And I kind of, go out to the group and say, like, well, isn't this the total number we planned for? It's just going to be okay. We're not going to just crash, are we? And everyone kind of looks at me and they go, well, we really don't know. So, well, that doesn't sound too good.
So what was the total at the end?
It's going to jump and suddenly it's going to go to black. I don't think that's a good experience for anybody, particularly for our brand and for YouTube and for Google. So the engineers are working frantically behind the scenes to offload a lot of the load onto other platforms and to kind of make sure we could handle this and not necessarily streaming it all in HD. And I think we got up to somewhere around 9 million live concurrents by the end of it, which is I think even today the biggest live concurrent event in the history of the web. I could be wrong, but I think at least back then it was, and it probably still is today. And it was a great success, and also I think reaffirmed sort of the value again of live content and being able to have this event streamed on a global basis and having people in every market and every country be able to see it, because it wasn't just about country specific distribution or regional distribution, it was about global distribution, and that's really what I think strengthened us at the time to kind of get people to adopt and be involved.
Before we go on to the next one here, really, I wanted to ask a question in sort of, if you're thinking, if you look at what Google and YouTube, of course, is doing right now, and where the world of live sports is heading, what do you think right now? What's your best guess, having worked there, of course, for several years and knowing the inside sentiments? Where do you see Google eventually coming in there as a rights, acquiring rights and putting real serious money on the table, or you just think that's not their mentality and they're never going to do it?
Well, I think even at the time I was there, we were seriously trying to bid for some major sports rights. We'd gotten approval to go out and bid for some major sports rights when I was at YouTube, and we made a pretty strong effort to do that. And I was pushing. Obviously, YouTube was advertising-based revenue, and I was saying, let's do subscription-based revenue, have tool revenue streams. You could even still have advertising on the subscription product. Right. I was really trying to move the sports offering, the live sports offering, to subscription. So we had a couple opportunities to get some major events at the time, but ultimately didn't win the bid, which was unfortunate. But I think coming out of that, maybe the speed to market for acquiring live sports rights and the amount of capital needed for some of these sports rights, which was really substantial based on the experience and how much revenue the platform was making, I think probably made it a little bit prohibitive. I think what I've learned is things always sort of happen a little slower than you think they're going to happen. And I think that you've seen, YouTube now, and certainly Amazon. Charlie Neiman, who'd been on our team at YouTube, is now running a lot of the sports effort out of Amazon in Seattle. You're trying to see them, I describe it, sort of taking tastes of different types of sports opportunities around football, around tennis. And I think, it's all part of learning. The platforms, there's no reason to make a massive, multiple $100 million or $1 billion investment. Let's learn with a slightly lower investment. But I think inevitably, back to my point, you're a global distributor. If you're Amazon, if you're YouTube, and frankly, even if you're Apple, if you're even Netflix, even though Netflix has said they're not going to do live sports, and you're certainly seeing a lot of this with the Zone anyway. They're acquiring a lot of sports rights and streaming those on a subscription basis, market by market. And I think they just launched their global offering too for their boxing content.
Yes, that's right.
So I think direct to consumer OTT is definitely is not going to go away. I mean, I think you'll see some of the broadcasters jump into this space more aggressively in their local market, so that you kind of have an opportunity to look at this on your connected TV. I mean, I probably spend most of my time when I watch sports content now just through a streaming experience. I mean, the Augusta Masters just took place last weekend and through Thursday and Friday also. And, I'm looking at all of that on a streaming platform versus, a broadcaster. I don't even think there is a broadcaster that shows it here in domestic Switzerland. But I think, you'll continue to see these platforms that have global distribution. I mean, look at the subscriber base that Netflix has now. I think they're up to 200 million global subscribers. That's a lot of revenue. When you're looking at, $10, $12, $15 a month per subscriber. That's a solid foundation for any platform. And I think, sports is a huge driver. It became, I remember Rupert Murdoch had said years ago, we see sports as the battering ram for our business to grow Fox in the USA. Yeah. And that became, a huge driver for them when they finally got a Fox Sports deal with the NFL, and were distributing NFL content on their platform. That legitimized them. And, I think that for any major platform, having live sports content really is hugely important, and will continue to grow with those platforms I've mentioned. But I think also for some of the smaller, what I describe as a niche sport, and not saying that in a pejorative way or negative way, but if you're skiing, you're not necessarily going to have a strong global audience like football has. But you have a really powerful, interested audience who loves that sport and would love to see that sport, and they're probably underserved. So if you're a federation like that and you can't get the broadcasters to pony up capital or to give you enough of their time slots to really, show the content appropriately in the local markets, why not go direct to consumer and build a platform and an offering that's direct to consumer that, is on a subscription basis, and expand that to create sort of a lifestyle destination around that, create merchandising, create, opportunities for endemic advertisers and brands to sell into that, because, you've got a known skiing audiences will be interested in buying skis and poles and boots and clothing. Absolutely. And then in addition to that, build a coaching, training, learning platform around that, so that people can actually develop their skills in the sport itself. So I think a rich ecosystem like that is certainly a way forward. There's some investment required on the front end, so maybe you're not going to get an immediate return on your investment in the first 12 or 24 months. But if someone takes a longer term view, I think that's directionally where those sports should be going.
Here's a question, and some of what we just talked about already leads perfectly into, of course, where you spent your last sort of 4 or 5 years with Wanda Sports there, and the role you had there. But before we jump in there, I actually want to ask you a question, because the way I look at it, again, from a broadcast point of view, a traditional broadcaster, the traditional, let's call it pay TV, pay operators, they needed the content because it brings the audience to them. Now, the YouTubes, the Googles, the Facebooks, Amazon, they don't need they have the audience already, right? They have billions of users in some fashion already globally. So in my mind, there is a difference of who needs who more. To some degree, the sport, of course, wants to talk to those billions of followers on YouTube and
yeah.
Facebook, versus, of course, the B Sky B needs that content to drive and continues to have those users to come to their platform.
Yep.
What's your view on that?
Well, if you're a broadcaster, I think your main focus and your main need is to basically satisfy your advertisers, right? That's kind of what you've got to focus on. You need to have a good offering for your advertisers. And it's getting a large audience for those advertisers. It's critically important, but you really don't care a whole lot about,
the viewership. You're not going to really care, who those viewers are. You're not going to, try and reinforce and help those viewers and have a direct relationship with those viewers. It's really about getting a lot of viewership and then getting an advertiser to, feel that this has been a really successful event because lots of people watch that. Maybe 50% of those people actually cared about the ad. And you don't know what 50% that is, but you got enough viewership to justify your advertising investment. And you got a return on your investment based on whatever CPM you paid. So, that's kind of the broadcaster mentality, and that's how broadcasters work.
Yeah, in the free-to-air world, right? But I mean, the pay world is a little different, right? Yeah.
But again, if you're able to go direct to the consumer and have a streaming experience, I think then that kind of reinforces for a federation the opportunity to build a subscriber relationship. You talk about personalization and using data and information about how users use your platform, consume content, and basically feeding up to them things that are relevant to their user experience. I mean, you'll certainly see that if you spend any time on YouTube, basically in your feed, it's going to reinforce the stuff you've been most recently watching on YouTube, and it's going to assume, the artificial intelligence is going to assume you're probably interested in seeing, if you happen to watch a lot of golf, it assumes you're going to be interested in seeing more golf, or if you watch surfing, you want to see more surfing. So it's going to serve up something that's relevant to you and then get you to watch even more. And I think that's kind of what users, millennial and other young users, are kind of expecting now from the experience when you're watching a sport. They want to kind of see more, and they probably not necessarily wanting to see lots more live, but they'd like to see a highlight that takes less time, but kind of shows the key athlete or the key events that took place during a sporting event. Right. You're seeing more and more consumption of highlights than you have in the past. It's up a huge percent. And a lot of that's just due to time constraints. You're on a mobile device most of the time, and you're going to look at something. You're not going to watch a 2 or 3 hour event just on your mobile device, but you're certainly happy to watch a 5 or 10 minute highlight summary of some of the key moments.
Yeah. Now, again, the question was a bit in the direction of, do you think that the money coming out of being able to be generated through YouTube, and right now, as you already said already, it's really a rev share model, right? It's not we're paying lots of upfront money, but we'll forecast either on maybe what advertising dollars we can generate, and then we'll give you, of course, a portion of that. And Facebook, I guess, is similar, right? It's all ad driven, really. So do you believe that the rev share model, right, let's say even as large as the audience is on YouTube and on Facebook, yes, et cetera, can that really ever replace the traditional pay model, right, from a pay broadcaster paying, hard dollars, upfront, which is an arbitrage model, right, completely different model than a revenue share model. Do you really think that the numbers can be stacking up, for rights holders?
Probably not. I think unless the YouTubes and the Amazons of the world become, rights buyers outright, as opposed to offering the rev, just being on a rev share model. And I think in some cases they are doing that, and they'll probably be more bullish about doing that as they build a subscription model around their offerings. Obviously, Amazon Prime Video is a quote and subscription model as part of your Prime relationship. Right. So there is a fee you're paying to kind of have access to that on a monthly or annualized basis. And certainly YouTube has a sort of a Me Too cable offering is on subscriber basis. And I think you can subscribe now to YouTube and be ads free. So I think as those revenue streams start evolving, and then you can then get a percentage of both the subscriber revenue and an advertising revenue, you're probably getting closer to parity at that point. So I think there's opportunities there. And I also think back to going direct to subscriber and build a subscriber base. If you back to skiing or equestrian, because I sit on an equestrian channel on their board, on a global basis, there's multi-millions of people that are interested in those sports, and if you can appropriately attract those people to subscribe at a reasonable price because they're underserved anyway, and have enough of the season of that sport along with other content that's relevant to them, be it coaching, training, learning content, or endemic brand content that you're going to make a purchase conversion on. I think those can be can take the place of what you're getting now from broadcasters. And in a lot of cases, the broadcasters are going to be more narrow in what they're going to spend money on. It's going to be about driving that big advertising rating, and what's going to do that. There's not a lot of sports that are going to do that for them other than soccer, and then the USA across American football, baseball, basketball, maybe a few other sports.
Yeah, true. I have recently had a couple of really interesting conversations with the world of esports, right? Which again, if you look at the streamers in that space, there are kids who make a lot of money streaming content, right? And that is obviously driven by the advertising dollars or ad rev share side of it. What's the model in Google? Is there a fixed model of how the revenue share is done as a percentage, as 50-50 or whatever, in what favor? Or is it really completely depending on the rights holder or the circumstances? How is that created? Can you share?
No, I think in almost all cases it's a fixed rev share between the rights holder and Google, YouTube, in terms of the content that's on their platform. So yes, I mean, and in some cases, the rights holder might have their own brand advertising they want to put up against the stream. If you're familiar with YouTube, there's a clickable pre-roll that comes in. There's sometimes a third ad that comes in, but whatever the CPM is for those ads. And if you're a bigger sport, take the NFL, they're probably, able to get, a $50, $70, $100 CPM for advertising around NFL football on YouTube. And if you're maybe a smaller sport, where you don't have as much advertiser interest to be associated with that sport, or they're just going to pay a lower CPM. And if you're even a sport that doesn't get a tremendous amount of viewership or even has a lot of other highlights on there, YouTube has their own programmatic advertising and lay on against it, and that might be $2 to $4 CPMs. It depends on each one, but there's a pretty broad range and the revenues that you can get depending on the sport that you are and the viewership you're going to get on the platform.
Okay, so it's really a fixed number of what the CPM you're getting, not so much on a percentage of it's $100 and YouTube keeps 50 and the other 50 is given up. Is that how it's done?
Yeah, I mean, in principle, if it's $100 CPM, YouTube will take a percentage, and the rights holder will take a percentage, and and if the ad's brought by the rights holder, maybe they get a higher percentage, and if the ad's laid on there by YouTube, maybe they get a higher percentage. I don't know what the latest negotiated deals are, but that's in principle kind of how it's structured.
At your time there, what was sort of roughly the percentage? You have a number in your head, or is it something you're officially?
Even if I remembered, it would probably be wrong, so I probably wouldn't want to quote.
No worries. Now let's quickly, and not necessarily quickly, but let's have a good look at where again you really spent a good 4 or 5 years here now, and where you are now, of course. I want to skip a little bit over GoPro, unless you have a particular story you like to share, and really want to spend a little bit of time with your days in Wonder Sports Group, which is really Infront when you started, and of course in HBS there. So all the things you've learned and everything you did, up to this time leading up, of course, the learning out of Google, I'm sure would have been amazing. So now you're back in again in an agency world, right? But you're very much in the production side of it, right? Producing content. Again, HBS, of course, is the host broadcaster of the FIFA World Cup, rugby, Asian Games, Euro, you name it. I mean, massive things, but it's very production specific, which really wasn't so much your space where you were otherwise, right? I mean, a lot of the other things I would say you were either in the business development or sales side of things, and now you're sort of more in becoming Mr. Production here. How did that all come about?
Well, I mean, we had, we at least had some touched on production when we were doing Universal Sports, though we weren't actually producing that many events ourselves. We did a few. And we certainly touched on some production at YouTube, but again, my involvement to actually, build a team to cover an event and, wasn't sort of my core experience set. But again, back to continual learning, as I, evolved my career, I always felt, well, what's something new I could do that further rounds me out to build a skill set around sports and, the direct, opportunity to produce content around a sporting event. Which is done by HBS, as you touched on, and also to come into what was a relatively traditional agency, very successful agency, Infront Sports and Media, which had then been acquired by the Wanda Corporation and Wanda Sports Group, and work with a professional team of people led by Philip Latter and the rest of the group there was super interesting. They just acquired a digital website app development company called Omnigon, which was based in New York City. They were trying to evolve their business model more into digital, and how could they become more of a digital offering with their rights holders and clients wanting to be able to do more there. there, and having to create also more touch points with brands who are saying, just tickets, hospitality alone or not, and board exposure alone are not really going to do it for us. We need kind of more assets. We have a lot more touch points with consumers on social media, at point of sale, on our websites. We need content. We need other ways to be able to interact with our consumers, and we need rights that will allow us to do that. So it was a good opportunity to come in and evolve that thinking within the organization, integrate Omnigon appropriately into the larger organization of Infront, and make sure they were working across all of our existing client base, and also to help and work on a new sort of virtual overlay machine learning product, which allowed organizations, if FIFA is streaming or distributing with broadcasters the World Cup in Doha, for example, which will happen in a few years, they could replace the boards on the field of play, so to speak, and show a different set of boards in China or a different set of boards in Japan or in Brazil. So you could then, as in principle, sell local sponsorships to the FIFA World Cup as opposed to just these global sponsorships, because you could replace the boards, and the global sponsors probably don't have all 90 minutes of the exposure around any given game at the World Cup. So you have X number of minutes you could sell locally, and so long as it wasn't a category that conflicted with the existing global sponsors, it could be incremental revenue to an organization like FIFA, and it could allow them to create some local relationships in those markets where they really just couldn't do that before. So it was really helping drive innovation across Infront, which was super exciting. And then the team at HBS, I mean, they're a really professional group of people that have done a lot of World Cups, and Francis Tellier, who headed it up when I arrived there, had been doing this since the 1998 World Cup in France. So they I think they're as good as it gets in terms of a group of people that know how to pull that off and be a host broadcaster for a big global event, be it the Asian Games, be it the Rugby World Cup, or in the case for FIFA, their big World Cup events, the men's and women's World Cups, and along with their other events. So there wasn't a lot I had to do to kind of improve things there. I think those guys understood it. I was at a fairly high level. I wasn't necessarily rolling up my sleeves and telling the team how to reproduce things or better produce things. But we were always thinking about how could you better innovate? How could you create sort of a digital product for the broadcasters? And a lot of the broadcasters didn't necessarily have the investment capacity to build a good digital offering of the World Cup. So how could we kind of create a VR, AR, and digital streaming product that they could then integrate into their live broadcast? So there was also a streaming component that was sophisticated with multiple camera views, multiple audio, and make it sort of a richer, deeper experience than they would have had normally if it was just the broadcast stream. So HBS did a lot of that with the team there, which I think has been pretty successul to diversify.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's huge. And again, we could probably spend a whole podcast just on HBS here of the amazing things they've done over the years. But we don't have that time. We're already running way over here, but it's all good. Now, again, a little bit here. One thing I like what you obviously were doing here. Really, you were setting up. You were working with startups, right? With new groups in sports tech, which is also a bit like what you're doing now in your own new business here. It was called the Infront Lab, which had, I guess, so an R&D division there where you're working with a whole bunch of guys, and of course Wizard, right, which is the virtual overlay what you mentioned earlier a bit. That seems to be like really where sort of you're leveraging, I guess, your knowledge of digital and everything you've learned and Google and others, over those years, and you're bringing it here, right? Is that sort of the best way to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, the exciting thing is, we some of the team members at in Infront, thought it'd be really interesting to kind of build Infront Lab. Christian Mueller, who headed up all of our BD efforts, was kind of one of the driving forces behind it. Kimmy Krantz also, and so we were sent off to Israel to meet a bunch of startups down there, and had a really good experience. A lot of these companies were kind of on the cutting edge of creating new offerings or more efficient offerings for consumers. And I spoke earlier, the ability to have clips and highlights and putting them appropriately on the different social platforms. What kind of clip and highlight would you put on YouTube, and when would you put it on YouTube versus on Instagram versus on Snapchat versus on Facebook? They're all kind of different types of offerings that should necessarily be put on there. And how could you kind of automate that in a way that was more efficient? So, around the Russia World Cup in 2018, we started testing things out, and also with some of the ice hockey events we had, we were testing things out with some of these startup companies based in Israel. One in particular, WSC, where it's sort of an automated clip and highlight service. We worked with them over a number of years, and we found that you could teach the machine, so to speak, to create clips and highlights of an ice hockey game pretty efficiently. Right. Instead of having 15 editors ready to create these clips and highlights almost real time or right after the game, you could teach the machine to do this with 2 or 3 editors and have just as good a content, if not better content, and even tell the machine where to post that content. So that kind of efficiency was good for the end user, the fan, good for the federation. You get more views and more interest in your content, and good for us because on the production side, it reduced basic costs and the number of people to do this work, so long as you top things in early on. And we were seeing that those kind of efficiencies could work in a whole variety of areas. So the lab, I think, has been a really good vehicle for Infront, has really helped kind of continue their effort to evolve. And then kind of coming out of my experience in Infront, it was great working with the team there. Super exciting. Brought in a new CEO, Dan Miodovnik, to run HBS. Put in a CEO to run was kind of reconstituted brand, which we now call Infront XIX. And Christoph Himes, who'd worked with me at YouTube and Google, came over to lead that effort up, and really great team there. It was a good, again, back to me, every 3 or 4 years, I kind of think, well, what am I going to do next?
And this was the time.
And was super excited about kind of all this, this sense that, technology and sport was at a nexus point, kind of like the early 2000s when all the technology boom with all the .coms and so forth. I think there's just a lot of richness now around AI, machine learning, sport, and the whole coaching, training, learning space. And you're seeing now coming out of COVID-19, just, my wife's a yoga teacher and an anti-gravity instructor, but she does a lot of yoga classes herself that she doesn't teach, but she takes the classes. And I've actually been starting to do a lot of them too, but now she can get on a yoga class taught by a guy named Chad, who's located in Santa Monica. He used to teach at a place called Yoga Works in Santa Monica. They've closed all the Yoga Works in California, and now Chad just basically does all of his yoga instruction through live streaming. Right. And he's now got students in Germany and in Spain and in Mexico, and my wife in Switzerland, and she's going to his class 3 times a week. I think a couple of his classes start at 7:30 in the morning in Santa Monica, so it's 4:30 here. Perfect timing for her. And you're seeing that a lot of this, the fitness and instruction and all that is, really congregating to a streaming solution, particularly coming out of COVID. A lot of gyms are even closed in a lot of marketplaces where people aren't real comfortable going to a gym. Yeah. So that, again, technology's really played a key role. You look at the success of Zoom, you look at the success of Peloton now, just coming out of the last 9 months. I don't think that's going to just stop and go away once there is a successful vaccine and things get more back to normal. I think there's still a mindset that, hey, why can't I just do it like this? And why can't instructors like Chad and yoga have a global audience? You can Absolutely. Get some on a global basis and have 60 people in this class versus 20. It just becomes a pretty interesting prospect.
Yeah, no, I follow this space very closely as well. I mean, let's call it the online fitness space, really, right? Yeah. What we're talking about here. Of course, the money they've raised is fairly substantial, right? The numbers you see there coming out of the U.S. Some of the high-profile investors are not just, let's call it your traditional private equity groups, but also big athletes, right? Steve Curry, I think, invested in one of them. And so clearly it is on the radar, I'm sure, for many people. I'm doing some work with a group out of Holland, which has an incredible, it looks like a mirror, right, which you have on the wall, and then you basically have all the competitions or all the exercises on it. So I'm doing some stuff with these guys. And again, I love the space. I think both, having it at home, of course, or in, let's say, a gym environment. I think these are all that is a huge future there. And again, you're right, Lisa. You're right. I don't think it is just COVID. COVID as usual has accelerated this and probably shown a bigger light on it than it would be otherwise. But yeah, it's a very interesting space. And to some degree, that's you've obviously left Infront recently or Wanda recently, and set up your own own agency, and it sounds like that's sort of the space you like playing in, right? Working with startups. You've done you obviously all your experience in what we just talked about here the last hour and a half, but also of course you knew how to raise money. You did it yourself with your own group you had there, Universal, etc. So this is that what you're doing right now? Is this sort of your final hooray here, or what do you see this at?
Well, I mean, it's just I'm working with a whole set of different startups in the coaching, training, learning space, in the digital advertising space. We launched an app in Mexico with a team out of an organization called TPI, Titleist Professional Institute. Greg Rose and Dave Phillips, they've built an app. They're really, they're the number one guys when it comes to training golf instructors. You're either TPI 1, level 2, or 3 certified. It's kind of a diploma you have as a golf instructor. So they really understand sport and instruction. And they built an app that was launched in Mexico at the end of February that I'd been involved in and advising them on. And it's had like 200,000 plus downloads. All the kids stopped all their normal coaching and training with their coaches in Mexico. The amateur younger kids, from 5 to 17-year-olds all had, everything got shut down for them. So everyone started downloading the app and doing the drills and skills on the app and sharing the information. You can build an avatar. You can share with your friends kind of how you're doing at the different developmental levels that exist as you run through the different skills and drills. And I think that's a real future around sport. As you think about FIFA and their efforts to invest in football development, football in schools. I think beyond just sending capital to the national federations, building tools for them to help build participation and build interest in the sport's really exciting. And I think we're kind of at a nexus point now where there's enough sophistication digitally so you can create an app that's really going to engage kids and get them to do their sport by just looking at it on a phone, so to speak. So it's a fun time right now.
It sure is. Now, I'm definitely going to wrap it up here now. But I want to have last question, and I couldn't quite see it. Whether you're doing anything in esports at all, or is it still mostly in the more, let's call it, traditional sports world?
Most of it's traditional. Some of my friends, Lucien Boyer just got really involved in an esports company. I think he just became chairman of a big esports company. We're going to actually talk tomorrow. We haven't been in touch for a little while. I've not done a lot in the esports space, but I think it's a huge growth area, between the federations, having their gaming opportunities, FIFA with their football offerings. And I just think it's a real growth area. It's just not something I've spent a lot of time on personally. We were involved in some esports stuff at Infront, and the team there was doing some investments in some esports companies. It's not that I'm not interested. I've got a 19 and 20-year-old son who's certainly spending a lot of time playing esports, right. And I've certainly spent some time doing that, usually losing badly to him at every game I play with him. I'll get my full accoutrement of guns and everything, and I'll just let him have a knife, and he still beats me easily. So it is what it is. But I think it's a really strong growth area. You've seen the kind of audiences you're getting and the participation levels here. It's super interesting. But I guess I'm more of a get off the couch kind of guy and get out there and exercise and be active. I think that, allows you to live longer, allows to help your brain be smarter, and allows you to take less medication as you get older and gives you a long life. So, nothing against esports, nothing against sitting and being a couch potato, so to speak, or being a participant there. I'm not saying that's bad, and it's probably good for your mind there too. But I do kind of probably want to reinforce kind of my mindset of what are the good things to do in your life. Not that esports is bad, don't get me wrong, but I think that I like to sort of spend where I have a big passion, and my passion is around participation and activation and getting underserved audiences an opportunity to see things or see sports that they just can't necessarily see as easily as they'd like. Just being able to find a sport in some cases that's being distributed in your country is never an easy thing right now. So, creating solutions like that, I think are critically important as the web gets more sophisticated and more tailored and focused to individual interests and needs.
Absolutely. I think you're a bit like me. There is always way too much to do than time of the day. The opportunities are everywhere, and exciting startups are coming up and asking for help, of course, or you see it yourself where the opportunities are. So we will have some more conversations on this, Claude. This was an incredible, more than an hour and a half now here. I think you actually beat David Falk, who was till now my longest I ever had.
I'm sure David had a lot more interesting and fun stories to tell about a lot of amazing personalities that he's worked with.
They were different, but I think you had a lot of great stuff in here. And again, there would be tons of learning for everyone in there across your different career paths, and all the way from what we talked earlier, from the Coca-Cola days to where we're now here. So this was fun. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time. Have a great day there, rest of the day there in Switzerland, and I'm sure we'll talk some more soon.
Thanks, Marcus. I really appreciate you hanging in here for this whole thing. I hope I didn't bore you and all of your listeners in the future, but it's been good talking about things. It was really exciting, and thanks for having me.
Definitely, it was fun, and we'll do some more. Thanks.
All right, have a great day. All the best. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.